career as an illustrator, my grandfather, Frank Frazetta, created a number of covers for Robert E. Howard's Conan books, for Carl Edward Wagner's Kane stories, and even for 2 of George MacDonald Fraser's Flashman novels. But I believe there was one author, more than any other, whose fiction he'll always be closely associated with, and that is Edgar Rice Burroughs. Welcome back to Frazetta Fridays with Frazetta Girls. I'm Sarah, and today we're taking a closer look at the life and legacy of Edgar Rice Burroughs and how his world helped inspire some of my grandfather's most unforgettable art. So let's get right into it. Edgar Rice Burroughs was born in 1875 in Chicago, Illinois, the 4th son of Major George Tyler Burroughs, a businessman and Civil War veteran, and his wife, Mary Evelyn Burroughs. He was educated at a number of local schools before attending Phillips Academy in Andover, Massachusetts, and then the Michigan Military Academy. He graduated in 1895, but he failed the entrance exam for West Point, so instead enlisted with the 7th U.S. Cavalry in Fort Grant, Arizona Territory. Yes, it was the same 7th Cavalry that had been led by Custer in the Battle of the Little Bighorn in 1876 and were responsible for the Wounded Knee Massacre in 1890. However, Burroughs' military service was fairly brief. He was diagnosed with a heart condition and he was discharged in 1897. Following his leaving the cavalry, Burroughs had a variety of jobs. He was a cowboy, the manager of a gold mining dredge, and a worker in his father's battery factory, and finally became a pencil sharpener wholesaler. By that time, he was married to his childhood sweetheart, Emma Hulbert, and they had 2, soon-to-be 3 children. Around 1911, Burroughs had been reading pulp fiction stories in his spare time and said that if people were paid for writing rot, such as I read in some of those magazines, that I could write stories just as rotten. As a matter of fact, although I had never written a story, I knew absolutely that I could write stories just as entertaining and probably a whole lot more so than I had ever chanced to read in those magazines. Using the pseudonym Norman Bean because he feared embarrassment, Burroughs had his first novel, Under the Moons of Mars, serialized by Frank Munsey in the February to July 1912 issues of the All Story. The adventure introduced John Carter, the Earth hero magically transported to Barsoom, which was what the inhabitants of Mars called their planet, and subsequently kicked off a series of books. That first novel earned him $400, which would be about $13,500 today. Not bad. Burroughs began writing full-time as a career, and before all of the chapters of Under the Moons of Mars had appeared in print, he had completed 2 novels, including Tarzan of the Apes, which was published in the October 1912 issue of the All Story. Tarzan was inspired by Rudyard Kipling's The Jungle Book stories about Mowgli, a feral little boy raised by wolves in the jungles of colonial India. Mowgli learns how to speak with other animals, partakes in various adventures, kills the villainous tiger Shere Khan, and eventually returns to live with the people. Burroughs' Tarzan is John Clayton, the baby son of British lord and lady who are marooned on the coast of Africa by mutineers. When Tarzan's mother dies from fever, his grieving father is attacked and killed by Kerchak, the leader of a tribe of man-sized apes known as the Mangani, a fictional species that's sort of a cross between gorillas and chimpanzees. The infant is saved by the female Mangani, Kala, who becomes his nurturing ape mother and names him Tarzan, meaning white skin in her language. As he gets older, Tarzan teaches himself English. I won't go into it, just read the first book. And like Mowgli, he learns how to talk to the animals. He grows up to be something of a jungle Superman, avenges his father by killing Kerchak, swings through the trees with his love Jane by his side, and fights and defeats tribes of cannibals, safaris of evil treasure hunters, and vicious beasts of every size and description. Tarzan quickly became Burroughs' most successful and enduring character, and he eventually wrote 24 books. He also continued to write other science fiction and fantasy stories involving heroes fighting on Mars and Venus, or exploring lost islands and civilizations on Earth, or even journeying beneath the ground to encounter a world populated by dinosaurs, alien races, and primitive peoples. He wrote westerns, mysteries, and historical romances as well. But it was Tarzan that became an international sensation, and Burroughs made sure to capitalize on the ape man's popularity. He and his estate ultimately saw Tarzan translated into other language and media, including a syndicated newspaper strip, nearly 50 films, hundreds of comic books, radio, plays, toys, collectibles, and eventually a TV series, both live action and animated. Although there were dozens of imitations that immediately sprung up in books and comics, none of them could seriously compete with Tarzan's popularity. Like Sherlock Holmes, James Bond, and Conan, Tarzan remains one of the most successful and well-known fictional characters of all time. Burroughs was in his late 60s and living in Honolulu at the time of the Japanese attack on on Pearl Harbor in 1941. Despite his age, he was allowed to enlist to become a war correspondent, becoming one of the oldest military reporters during World War II. After the war ended, Burroughs moved back to California. Suffering from various health problems, he died of a heart attack on March 19, 1950, at the age of 74. He is buried appropriately in Tarzan, California. Famed zoologist Jane Goodall describes the Tarzan series as having a major influence on her childhood. She states that she felt she would be a much better spouse for Tarzan than his fictional wife Jane, and that when she first began to live among and study the chimpanzees, she was fulfilling her childhood dream of living among the great apes just as Tarzan did. Ray Bradbury once said that Edgar Rice Burroughs was probably the most influential writer in the entire history of the world. I've talked to more biochemists and more astronomers and technologists in various fields who, when they were 10 years old, fell in love with John Carter and Tarzan and decided to become something romantic. Burroughs put us on the moon. All the technologists read Burroughs. And my grandpa, well, he literally grew up with Tarzan. As a child, he absolutely loved Hal Foster's Sunday newspaper comic strip adaptation, and he studied the hell out of J. Allen St. John's covers and illustrations for the pulps and books that his uncle would bring home to him. Frazetta would thrill to the Tarzan serials and feature films playing in the theaters like Tarzan the Fearless starring Buster Crabbe and The New Adventures of Tarzan starring Herman Brix, but it was 1934's Tarzan and his mate starring Johnny Weissmuller and Maureen O'Sullivan that he would always mention as his favorite. And I suspect that O'Sullivan's very skimpy costume and the nude swim by her double, Josephine McKim, made his little heart beat as fast as the movie's climactic fight with the native tribe and their lion allies. In an interview with Russ Cochran, my grandpa said that while growing up in Brooklyn, all of my friends thought that they were Tarzan. We were always competing for Tarzan of the Month, climbing billboards and running along the tops of them, leaping from high places and all that stuff. And me, being more imaginative, I guess, I imagined that I did it better. Really, I don't know if I imitated Tarzan as much as his leopards, but I climbed trees very well. Frazetta's love for the worlds created by Edgar Rice Burroughs eventually carried over to his art too. As a child, he had drawn a comic loosely based on the Cave Girl, and it could be argued that the novel also inspired his later unsold newspaper strip titled Nina. When Burroughs was publishing his own art books, he would include a symbol on the spine as sort of a logo that was based on a trail marker he would carve on trees during family camping trips, and it's been suggested that the famous Frazetta signature was at least partly inspired by that symbol. Others have said that my grandfather's signature was directly inspired by Hal Foster's when he was drawing the Tarzan newspaper strip, and both opinions are certainly possible, but without being able to ask Frazetta, we'll never know for sure. When he was 24, Magazine Enterprises gave Frazetta the opportunity to create his own comic book. He collaborated with writer Gardner Fox to produce the Thun'da #1 in 1952, which was clearly inspired by Tarzan and other stories by Burroughs like Pellucidar and At the Earth's Core. Frazetta's art, with its fluid brushwork, skillful drawings, and youthful enthusiasm, captured a world filled with prehistoric landscapes, dinosaurs, cavemen, and beautiful women. Thun'da #1 was the only comic he ever drew in its entirety. He quit after the first issue when the publisher licensed the character to Columbia Pictures for the serial King of the Congo starring Buster Crabbe without giving Frazetta credit or a share of the proceeds. As noted in an earlier episode, my grandfather left freelancing and worked as a ghost artist on Al Cap's wildly popular newspaper strip Little Abner from 1954 to 1961 until he got into an argument with Cap over money and quit. Frazetta thought it would be easy to either join another studio or take up freelancing where he'd left off, but it proved to be extremely difficult at first. None of the other cartoonists would hire him, and his former clients in the comic book industry had either all gone out of business or considered his style too old-fashioned for the new superhero titles that they were publishing. Frustrated, angry, and more than a little discouraged, my grandpa changed his career path to illustration and began looking for assignments from book and magazine publishers. That didn't prove to be easy either, until Tarzan and his friend Roy Krinkle changed his fortune. In 1962, Manhattan bookstore owners Jack Biblo and Jack Tannen started a small press called Canaveral Press to publish books by Edgar Rice Burroughs and others, many which featured interior art. After a misstep with another artist who was unsuited for the material, they commissioned one of their frequent customers. You guessed it, Roy Krinkle, to illustrate their edition of The Cave Girl in 1962. Krinkle, knowing that Frazetta was actively trying to find work, encouraged Canaveral to give his friend a job too. They agreed to take a chance and commissioned Frank to create the art for Tarzan at the Earth's Core that same year. Reader response was immediate and enthusiastic, and Grandpa was quickly hired to illustrate Burroughs' Tarzan and the Castaways, At the Earth's Core, and Pellucidar. He really needed the money and for once didn't procrastinate as he was known to do. Frazetta completed all of the drawings in record time and was promptly paid, but only the Tarzan book saw print several years later in 1964. It's possible that the Burroughs estate wouldn't sell the rights to publish At the Earth's Core and Pellucidar, but that's only a guess. Some of the art by my grandfather, along with the other unused illustrations by Al Williamson and Reed Crandall, eventually were included in Richard Lupoff's biography, Edgar Rice Burroughs' Master of Adventure, which was released by Canaveral in hardcover in 1965 and reprinted by Ace Books in paperback. Unfortunately, my grandpa got into a dispute with the publishers about the return of his original art. Biblio and Tannen insisted they owned everything, including the originals, and the argument became so heated that my grandpa was thrown out of the store by a policeman and threatened with arrest if he returned. Frazetta bitterly remembered, "That's when I first met the crumbs and crooks in the business." It was around that time of the argument that he was shocked by the look of fury on his face while looking in the mirror, so he sat down to capture the moment with his now famous self-portrait. And finally, that history is sorted out. But regardless of his falling out with the publisher, those cathartic drawings for the Canaveral Press turned out to be some of his most popular and exciting illustrations ever. Completed when he felt he had something to prove and displaying his mastery of brush and ink, they are unquestionably some of his finest drawings. And with Krinkle's help and encouragement, those illustrations, along with a tryout painting based on Tarzan and the Ant-Men, ultimately helped convince Donald Wollheim, the reluctant editor at Ace Books, to give Frank his first paperback cover assignments for their line of Burroughs paperback. And history was made. In our next episode, Burroughs Part 2, I'll take a look at my grandfather's numerous paintings and illustrations for the Burroughs titles published by Ace Books and the Science Fiction Book Club. In the meantime, if you'd like to see his drawings for the Canaveral Press, we have our first book published by Frazetta Girls, Frank Frazetta Fine Lines, and it is available on FrazettaGirls.com. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this episode, please like and subscribe and tell a Frazetta fan where to learn more about the godfather of fantasy art. I'll see you soon for Part 2.